Welcome, dearly beloved chosen ones. The moment a person decides to truly change, the entire universe rearranges itself to test whether they mean it. Chosen one. That's exactly what happened the day you made the decision, not the day things got better, not the day people noticed, the day you looked at your own reflection and said, "This version of me is not the final version." That single decision was an earthquake no one else could feel, but you felt it. Deep in your bones, in the center of everything that makes you who you are, something cracked open. And from that crack, something unstoppable started growing. Here's the fact they'll never tell you. Studies show that genuine transformation doesn't begin with action. It begins with identity. The moment you decided you were the kind of person who could change, you had already won the first battle. Every step after that was just evidence collecting. You didn't flip a switch. You rewired an entire electrical system. And while the world kept watching for fireworks, you were doing the invisible work, the work that happens at 5 in the morning when no one is cheering, the work that happens when you choose silence over reaction, when you choose discipline over excuse, when you choose the long road because you finally understand that shortcuts only delay arrival. You became the kind of person who scares comfortable people, not because you're loud, because you're serious. Number 1. Your transformation began the day you stopped explaining yourself to people who were never going to understand you. For a long time, you believed that if you just explained yourself clearly enough, people would finally get it. You kept trying to make them see your vision, your potential, the direction you were moving in. But explanations to closed minds are like water poured into sealed containers. Nothing gets in. Nothing changes. You were exhausting yourself trying to justify a version of yourself they weren't qualified to evaluate. The turning point came when you stopped, not out of arrogance, out of clarity. You realize that people who need you to explain your worth have already decided you don't have any. And you quietly removed yourself from that courtroom. You stopped being the defendant in trials you didn't consent to. That silence, that withdrawal from justification, wasn't defeat. It was the first act of a new authority. You started investing the energy you used to waste in explanation into actual construction. You built while they talked. You moved while they debated whether you could. And eventually, the results became the only statement you needed to make. There's a reason the most transformed people in history were misunderstood before they were celebrated. Transformation requires operating in a frequency most people around you haven't tuned into yet. Their confusion about you was never your problem. It was simply proof that you had outgrown the channel they expected you to stay on. Number 2. You discovered that discipline is not punishment. It's the highest form of self-respect. Before your transformation, discipline felt like a cage, something imposed on people who lacked freedom. You associated it with rigidity, with joylessness, with the kind of life where color had been drained out. But the moment you actually committed to it, you discovered something no one had prepared you for. Discipline doesn't restrict your life, it constructs it. Every morning you chose to show up for yourself, you were casting a vote. A vote for the version of you that you claimed to want. And votes don't feel dramatic, they feel quiet. They feel like eating when you'd rather skip, sleeping when you'd rather scroll, practicing when you'd rather perform, moving when every comfortable instinct says stay. But those quiet votes accumulate, they compound. And one day you looked up from the work and realized that the person you had imagined becoming was standing in your shoes, looking back at you from the mirror. And you couldn't quite remember the exact moment the transformation completed, because it didn't complete. It was always in motion. The discipline wasn't the means to the end. It was the identity itself. The chosen one doesn't wait to feel motivated. The chosen one shows up and lets the motion create the momentum. Number 3. Your transformation forced you to grieve the identity you were performing for other people's comfort. This part no one talks about, because it's uncomfortable in a way that doesn't make for clean inspiration content. When you truly began to change, you had to let go of versions of yourself that other people loved. Not you. Them. The version of you that was easy to handle. That stayed in the lane they picked. That laughed at the right moments and stayed quiet at the wrong ones. Letting go of that performance felt like loss, because it was. There were relationships that only worked because of who you were pretending to be. When you stopped the performance, those connections struggled, some ended, and the grief was real, even though the thing being grieved was never truly yours to keep. But here's what emerged from that grief: a self that was finally load-bearing. Not decorative, not built to impress, built to last. Your new identity didn't need to be explained because it didn't exist for an audience. It existed because you decided it would. And that kind of identity, the kind you build in private with intention, is almost impossible to destroy because it was never dependent on applause to stay standing. Number 4. You learn to become comfortable living in the gap between who you are and who you are becoming. There is a space, an uncomfortable, uncertain, disorienting space that every genuine transformation moves through. It's the place where the old version of you has already been left behind, but the new one hasn't fully arrived yet. Most people rush through this gap. They sprint back to the familiar, or they fake arrival before they've actually gotten there. You learn to live in it. You learned that the gap is not a sign of failure. It's a sign of movement. Only people who are genuinely changing experience it. The static never feel the discomfort of becoming. You learn to sit in the uncertainty without collapsing, to hold two truths at once. I am not yet what I intend to be, and I am already no longer what I was. That dual awareness is rare. It requires a kind of emotional maturity that most people spend decades trying to develop. And in that gap, something quietly crystallized. Your tolerance for discomfort became your greatest asset, because the world runs on people avoiding discomfort, and the moment you stopped running with them, you gained access to territory most people never reach. The hardest rooms are always the emptiest, not because no one wants what's inside them, but because almost no one is willing to walk through the discomfort to get there. You walked. That's why you're here. Number 5. The people who left during your transformation were not losses. They were the process completing itself. When you began to change, people left. Some suddenly, some slowly, with increasing distance that neither of you formally acknowledged. And in certain moments, those departures felt like evidence against your transformation, like the universe's way of saying, look at what your growth is costing you, like maybe the price of becoming was too high. But watch what those departures actually revealed. Every person who exited did so because they had reached the limit of what they could offer a version of you that was evolving. Their presence in your old life was context-dependent. They were aligned with a situation, a mindset, a version of your circumstances that no longer existed. When the circumstances changed, the alignment broke. That's not tragedy, that's precision. The people who stayed were the ones whose connection to you wasn't situational. It wasn't built on what you provided or who you performed. It was built on something durable enough to survive the shift. Those people are your real circle, and they're often smaller in number than the crowds you used to maintain. But smaller circles with deeper alignment produce a quality of support and honesty that large, comfortable crowds never can. You didn't lose people. You revealed which connections were real. Number 6. You stopped asking for permission to become the version of yourself you already knew you needed to be. At some point in your past, you understood who you could be. You saw it clearly, not with arrogance, with knowledge. The kind of self-knowledge that sits quietly at the center of you and refuses to go away, no matter how many times you try to distract yourself from it. The vision didn't fade. It waited. And for a long time, you delayed acting on it, not because you didn't believe in it, but because part of you was waiting for someone to confirm it was okay, waiting for the nod, the green light, the external signal that said, yes, go ahead. The version of you that you're imagining is acceptable. Go become it. Your transformation began the day you stopped waiting, not because the permission came, but because you realized it was never going to. The people around you were not withholding permission out of cruelty. They simply didn't have it to give. Permission to become yourself is a thing you can only give yourself, and the moment you did, everything accelerated. The clarity that had been stuck behind hesitation started moving. The action you had been deferring started happening. The version of you that had been waiting behind the curtain walked onto the stage, and the audience had to adjust. They hadn't been told the show was changing, but it was. And it is. Number 7. Your consistency became the argument you no longer had to make out loud. In the early days of your transformation, you still felt the pull to announce it, to explain the changes you were making, the direction you were heading, the reasons behind the new decisions. You wanted people to understand before they could see the evidence. That impulse is human. But it's also the thing that dilutes transformation before it fully arrives. You learn to stop announcing and start compounding. You learn that the most powerful version of any argument is the one that doesn't need to be spoken, the one that accumulates silently in your results, your posture, your presence, and your trajectory. Day after day, choice after choice, you laid bricks on a wall that other people eventually stopped being able to ignore. And the fascinating thing about consistency is that it eventually becomes its own reputation. You don't have to tell people you're reliable. You don't have to convince anyone that you're serious. The pattern speaks, the record speaks, and when it does, it speaks with an authority that no single speech, no single announcement, no single moment of inspiration could ever match. They eventually stopped questioning whether you were serious, because the evidence made the question obsolete. Number 8. You learn to receive victory without immediately dismantling it with doubt. This is one of the quieter, harder edges of transformation, one that most success content never touches, because it's not glamorous, but it's essential. You learned what it meant to win something and actually let yourself experience it, without immediately pointing at the next mountain, without qualifying the achievement before you'd even finished standing on it, without performing gratitude on the outside, while quietly picking apart why it wasn't enough on the inside. Somewhere in your transformation, you developed the practice of landing, of letting the moment of arrival actually mean something before it became the new baseline. This is harder than it sounds, because high-functioning, ambitious, evolving people are wired for the next thing. The forward lean is their natural posture. But if you never land, you never actually experience winning. You just experience the motion of winning without its substance. You learn to pause, to acknowledge, to say quietly to yourself, I came from there. I am now here. This required work. This required sacrifice. This deserves a moment. That practice isn't weakness, it's calibration. It's what keeps the ambition from becoming a machine that grinds the person operating it into dust. Number 9. Your transformed self changed the standard of what people around you thought was possible. This is one of the effects of genuine transformation that rarely gets named, because it's not about you at the center of it. It's about the ripple. When you changed, you gave something to the people watching that can't be manufactured or explained. Evidence. Living, walking, verifiable evidence that it's possible. Not in a theoretical, inspirational sense. In a real, specific, personal sense, because they know your story. They know where you started. They know the conditions you were operating in when this all began. They can't dismiss your transformation as luck or advantage or circumstance that doesn't apply to them. They have to sit with the fact that it happened to a real person they actually know, and that makes the excuses harder to sustain. Not because you said anything, because you existed. You never knew how many private decisions were quietly influenced by watching you make yours. How many people started moving because they saw you move? How many things changed in circles you're not even part of, because the evidence of your transformation traveled further than you can track? Your victory was never only yours. It was always also a permission slip for everyone who had been using your stagnation as a reason to stay still. Number 10. You won today, not because everything was perfect, but because you showed up anyway. Today was not a clean day. Today had friction. Today had moments where the easier choice was right there, accessible, justified, and you still didn't take it. Today had a version of the old you knocking on the door, wearing a familiar face, speaking in a familiar voice, offering the familiar comfort of the path you've already walked. And you said no, not loudly, not dramatically, just clearly. You showed up. You did the thing you committed to doing. You maintained the standard you've been building toward. And in a world engineered for comfort, for distraction, for the path of least resistance, showing up when it's hard is not a small thing. It is the thing. The chosen ones are not the ones for whom everything worked perfectly. They are the ones who showed up on the days when nothing worked at all and built anyway. Today you won, not because the score was favorable, not because the conditions were ideal, not because someone handed it to you. You won because you chose to, again. As you have been choosing, quietly, consistently, deliberately on all the days no one was watching. That is the transformation. That is the victory. And it belongs entirely to you. Conclusion. Your transformation was never the dramatic moment. It was the 1,000 quiet moments where you chose differently. Every choice to stay when the old you would have fled. Every decision to grow when comfort was right there, offering to hold you still. Every morning you reached for a higher version of yourself before the world had a chance to remind you of a lower one. You didn't transform to prove anything to anyone watching. You transformed because somewhere inside you, you already knew who you were supposed to be. And you finally decided that person deserved to exist. This is your era, not the era of proving, not the era of explaining, not the era of waiting for the signal, the era of being, fully, unapologetically, completely. The chosen one doesn't wait to be recognized. They recognize themselves. And in that recognition, the world has no choice but to follow. If this message landed somewhere real in you, subscribe to this channel so you never miss what's coming next. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear that transformation is real, that it's possible, and that they are not as far from it as they think. Leave a comment and tell me, where is your transformation taking you? I want to know. God bless you and keep going.